This is a 4-step program for those stupid poor people. Step 1, print a lot of money. Step 2, asset and good prices skyrocket. Step 3, tax as much of the capital gain as possible, quote unquote, capital gain. Step 4, blame Loblaws.
That's
That's
well,
the
they gotta
that's the
pay their
Jagmeet
share.
Singh, yeah, that's right. The Jagmeet Singh School of Economics, I guess. There's a very frightening graph of the Canadian money supply, and from 1955 to the current day, and
Normally it curves, but that is a right angle.
that is a complete right angle. Yeah, that is not nice to look at.
Being able to store your wealth becomes harder and harder
Yeah,
as you're basically gambling to beat inflation.
yeah,
The government is actively devaluing your hard-earned work, and we're trying to escape that, and which makes the capital gains tax. Any changes in that, that's very much it's sold as a tax on the rich. Again, that's capital gains within a year. So maybe you have somebody with a small business who's selling part of their business off or exchanging, like $600,000 in a year for somebody's decades of accumulation of hard-earned work. That's actually not as much as people think.
Hello and welcome back to the Critical Compass. My name is Mike, and this is James with me today, as every day, because we're the only two people on this podcast. Today we've got a couple topics that we want to discuss. James is going to start us off. We're going to talk about it's tax season in Canada, and I think probably the U.S. And we've gotten some in Canada. We've gotten some new tax burdens this year. A lot of people are unhappy with how. With the new budget release and the some of the tax changes and additions that have come with it. James is going to give us a bit of a background on some concepts here, and then we'll talk about the particulars after that.
Yeah, I guess it's worth understanding just a few things about kind of the stealth tax that exist, and inflation's one of them. But a lot of people think it's a greed-driven inflation where prices are just increasing because of companies just wanting more and more money. But you get these ripple effects, but the primary driver is going to be the expansion of the money supply. And this is where every year our government's in more and more debt, and which means it's issuing bonds, and then banks issue out debt for it's lending at certain rates for mortgages or auto loans and anything where somebody just needs financing. This is money issued through new debt. And every time new debt is created, the value of your money is decreased. And we can think of that as it's just a representation of our like hard-earned time. This we put in the hours of labor, and we try to store that value in a piece of paper or in our kind of digital bank account, so we can exchange that for somebody else's labor in the future. As as the supply increases, the value of our hard-earned work decreases as well. So we can't really store value right now. And that's problem number one, because there's no way of saving. So what we're forced to do is we're forced to gamble. We are forced to invest in something that may or may not have a percent return that outpaces inflation. And now when we invest and we make money, there's a capital gains on that as well. We will touch on the capital gains in a second, but we have tax brackets, and the one thing that's never really talked about, or hasn't been talked about as much, is do our tax brackets adjust according to inflation? Does it always match inflation? And one of the problems is how we measure inflation is our CPI. consumer price index.
Notoriously problematic, right?
It's problematic because all it reflects is a basket of goods, and that basket of goods can change year to year. And what they do is they sample, for example, they'll take 10 items and they'll compare those 10 items and see, and they'll average within those 10. But not all items change year to year. You may have something like, well, maybe you have a 30% increase in some food item, but maybe they will include in that basket of items like a computer GPU or a CPU that decreases is in price. So you can fudge the numbers, and it doesn't always reflect real inflation. So we've already got a skewed idea there. And right now we don't know if tax brackets, how well they match with inflation. So if anything, right now, $50,000 a year, which used to be a decent amount, and within that tax bracket, like it feels like people are getting taxed a little bit higher to begin with, or it's also changing the threshold of how many people are considered in poverty. So these are very arbitrary numbers, and they keep on adjusting. So with that being said, we've got a very distorted idea of price signals. It's changing every year. We have a distorted idea of how much of our labor and our time is actually being maintained. And well, I guess we kind of mentioned before, Mike, do you want to kind of explain how money gets diluted every time, like from income tax to sales tax to...
Yeah, it's more than just a number, and it misses the amount of times that you get taxed on your earnings, which you use to buy goods and services that are taxed. The goods and services from whom you buy, those people are also paying tax on those earnings. And so what you see is you see a devaluation of the dollar for every purchase that gets made along the chain. So when you have people talking a lot about a circular economy, which, the benefits of a circular economy, and that would be something that's very traceable on a smaller scale. So if you have something like, you have a small town and you have a farmer and a blacksmith, and this is a small town from the 1800s. You have a farmer and a blacksmith and a baker and a candlestick maker, and each one of them goes to the other when they need something. They pay in cash, and that person uses that cash to buy something else that they need to supplement whatever they don't make for themselves. That's a good example of an economy that would have long-term stability because at each part of the chain, the purchasing power of the money used retains its value. When you have there was a good example of this made by somebody popular in who knows more about the economy than I do, that shows the actual percentages that you lose by to use an example of a modern example. When you tap your credit card somewhere, the cash, like Moneris or whoever the payment processor is, takes a portion off the top. Visa or MasterCard takes a portion off the top. The money that the business that you've just bought something from, they lose a portion to GST and the taxes that they pay as a business at the end of the year. And so it's like I said, you devalue the dollar at every time you use it in this type of economy.
Yeah, and whatever amount we start with is just less and less and less that. And there are accounts of like, well, at the end of the day, you're sitting at like, well, 60% of what you actually earned from the start is actually usable at the end of the day in even less. So like can be up like down to 50%. So I think it relies on the ignorance of the average person for this kind of this tomfoolery to continue to exist.
Well, you have. I watched a video recently. If I can find it, we'll link to it. Of a woman explaining how her 6-figure income is not enough to sustain her family of. I think they had 3 kids. It was her and her husband. And
that
3
was
kids.
in Toronto.
Yeah.
If I remember if we're thinking of the same.
I think it
same
is,
clip.
yeah. And she was explaining her like, and she's not living outside of her means. Like you see sometimes these like flat lays of groceries that people buy, and like, oh, this is how much $200 gets you at a grocery store, and it's all crap. Like it's all like high priced, snacks and things like that, and not a lot of real food, you could say. But no, this was legit. Her rent and her car payment in order to get to and from work, and her the food bills for the family and all kinds of things. And so it adds up to a point where on paper she's got a really quite a lucrative job, but that is not translating to any ability to move forward. She doesn't. I think she said of her $102 or $104,000 salary, she was left with, I think, on an average month between $200 and $400. That wasn't.
Yeah, and that was with kids and a stay-at-home
That's right.
father at that point. So the whole idea of it like a single parent income is becoming less and less attainable. Also, the being able to store your wealth becomes harder and harder.
Yeah,
as you're basically gambling to beat inflation.
Yeah.
The government is actively devaluing your hard-earned work, and we're trying to escape that, and which makes the capital gains tax. Any changes in that? That's very much. It's sold as a tax on the rich. Again, almost like, well, if somebody's earned money, it's not within. Well, it's not because they did anything to earn it. It's feels like it's very much a class punishment at that point. But what people don't realize is that that's capital gains within a year. So maybe you have somebody with a small business who's selling part of their business off or exchanging, like $600,000 in a year for somebody's decades of accumulation of hard-earned work. That's actually not as much as people think.
Yeah.
There are more people that might either, let's say they bought a second home as an investment, again, to try to store some of their wealth in something that they were thinking that would maintain value, like a house is a house no matter what, where other investments may or may not do well. A company may go under, but a house is still, it can still be lived in. You can still sell it.
It's always at least on a piece of land too.
Yeah. So, I think you had some links on kind of explaining some of the taxes that have popped up.
Yeah. And I have just an example here. I won't link to the tweet. I'll just read it here from my phone. But this is an illustrative example on small dollars that people can make sense of what this capital gains tax change really looks like. So here's the simplified version. Assume a $200 income at a 50% tax rate. You can invest and make 20% in a year. So in the current system, you've got a $200 income. You get $100 of that after tax. You get $120 of that after investment, and $110 after the capital gains tax, the old capital gain tax. You've essentially turned $100 into $110. In a system where you're taxed once at the end of the year on all income and capital gains, $200 income becomes $240 after investment, becomes $120 after all taxes. So does that make sense?
Yeah, it's the capital gains is above your set income. It's everything on top, and then a portion of that income is taxed.
I'm going to share a screen here from Scott Stevenson on X. So he says, the dark secret of capital gains tax during inflation, it taxes you for gaining nothing. If you have $400,000 in retirement assets and 25% more money is printed, your assets are now worth $500,000, but you are no richer. The dollar just became 25% less valuable. Although you are no richer, you will be taxed as if you made $50,000 to $66,000. You really made nothing. You just became poorer and experienced no upside. This is an effect that can impact every middle-class person saving for retirement, owning a cottage, running a small business, owning a startup, stock options, etc.
I think that really shows the reality of as we're seeing a change of like the small percentage of the world getting richer and richer and people getting poorer and poorer. The best way to look at that is that the people who are able to maintain some value in hard assets will be able to maintain their assets will increase in value. And then if somebody's barely able to get a few dollars in their bank account every year, they're being taxed with a stealth tax and don't even realize it.
Yeah.
Or they borrow money and now they're paying massive amounts of interest. And I can understand why like so many people would they would get themselves in debt right away. Like, well, because it gets them something now, which just means they are indebted. Their labor is indebted for more years after that.
Well, and Scott Stevenson also has a post on that, and I will share that as well. This is a 4-step program for those stupid poor people. Step 1, print a lot of money. Step 2, asset and good prices skyrocket. Step 3, tax as much of the capital gain as possible, quote unquote capital gain. Step 4, blame Loblaws. That's the
well, they gotta
that's the Jagmeet Singh. Yeah, that's right. The Jagmeet Singh school of economics, I guess. It's such a silly thing. Every time I see it, I wonder, is there going to come a time when Galen Weston just decides to sue the entire federal NDP? But I don't know. It's there's a very frightening graph of the Canadian money supply, and from 1955 to the current day. And
normally it curves, but that is a right angle.
That is a complete right angle. Yeah, that is not nice to look at. So I've also got here. We'll just we'll go into the basically the full scope of the
changes,
the tax changes. Yeah. So this is TD Leaker on X. Here are the top 10 ways in which costs or taxes will increase according to Budget 2024. So capital gains tax, as we said, so the inclusion rate for capital gains rises from 1/2 to 2/3. Digital services tax, luxury tax. That's a fun one because guess who gets to decide what luxury means? Number 4, tobacco and vaping products as if they weren't taxed enough. Public debt charges, GST on carbon emissions. That could be a whole series of episodes unto themselves. Increase in public sector wage costs. Shocking that they would continue to make the government the primary employer of Canadians. Number 8, environmental compliance costs. That's another good one that links to number 6. Air traveler security charge, and an alcohol excise tax. So basically, you've got a whole lot of vice taxes here. You've got dubious environment related taxes, and just
compliance environmentally could mean many things. So that's something that could be, depends on how you define it, and that could be tricky. So those are all taxes on, if it's things that are bought or sold, that's one side of things. But another thing that can affect prices is, like, obviously the expansion of the monetary supply is the main driver, but as you get an increasing government size, and they brag about how many new jobs there are, and then you look at the numbers and the mostly public sector jobs, as you get an increase government size and you have more regulations and more red tape to go through, let's say you have a building, like a development company, and they're building a bunch of houses, and to get all the permits takes another 2 months. And that's 2 months they could not be finishing up that project and starting another project. And that's 2 months of, well, they haven't made money from that yet. And those delays, those costs get transferred to the consumer, because at some point they got to cover their business expenses. They're already taxed for whatever. They got to make money. Therefore, any slowdown in the process will increase costs as well. So it's like additive everything on top of everything. Like it's no surprise that you would have such changes in price year to year.
Well, that's right. And then it also disincentivizes um builders even getting into these projects at all, and it ensures that only the wealthiest land developers will be the ones that can weather that administrative cost. You don't get little startup companies. You don't get little communities being built by small local or provincial builders. It becomes something that only nationalized two or three or four companies can do, and then what's to like everyone knows what happens long term for that is that you end up in creating a a triopoly or a similar type of structure as we see in um our telecom industry, which has become the same thing. It's regulated to hell. No one can enter our market, and it just becomes another thing that Canadians get to pay for no good reason other than we've decided that the red tape involved is ostensibly for the betterment of something.
Yeah, and I guess we don't have the accountability to really reflect on what red tape is necessary, what is actually doing
Yeah.
what it's supposed to, because it's hard to argue that like zero regulations would be beneficial. Like that
Yeah, I don't
would
think
get
even
abused. You'd
yeah.
want enough constraints to like make sure that a company's just not dumping raw sewage into drinking water. Like there's some
Yeah.
basic things like that where like, yeah, it's easy to make a case for some like basic regulations there. But if if a water assessment took 4 years, where like maybe in the free market they would have, well, the testing itself and writing up a report would only take a month. And if the amount of hands it got passed between 3 different departments and they all had to like send it off for another referral, and then they needed, like, you can see how something that started in a good place could just get progressively worse and worse and worse, and there isn't the accountability to really adapt or improve that.
Yeah. In fact, there's that's disincentivized too, because you've created this bureaucracy of administrative rules that exist solely to facilitate the red tape that was put in place to do the initial task. So now the people who are running those departments and those bureaucracies have absolutely no incentive to make themselves redundant. Why would they do that? They would increase further red tape on that to ensure that there's more people along the chain, to ensure that their role becomes progressively higher and higher in the hierarchy of nonsense jobs that don't do anything. So I did have a question for you though, and we didn't talk about this before or prepare for this, but um what would your response be to somebody who said, referring to the rapid inflation of the money supply in the last 4 years, that well, the government of Canada needed to do that because people were losing their jobs due to COVID or some such related
The
argument?
Yeah, no, I've definitely heard that one more than once. Um, so Canada created a problem that they solved with COVID checks and, well, the strict restrictions on shutting down. And I know it wasn't just federally mandated, but you did have kind of people walking within law. Like you had the provincial governments following the lead of federal, which followed the lead of kind of these what other non-government organizations were suggesting to be done, despite evidence of lockdowns not being an effective tool. And maybe at some point we follow up on, well, the Great Barrington Declaration and some of these it was a collection of data painting the case of why lockdowns do more harm than good. So given that is, you can't say that they didn't have the information that was ignored. It was more dogmatic in the sense of they believed that it was necessary. Also, you could paint the case of like in a leadership role, you are almost required to do something rather than not do something.
Lest you
wait
look
and see
weak or
report.
yeah.
It either makes seem like you're not doing anything, therefore you're not doing a job, therefore you're not worthy of re-election, or you'll get scorned for not doing enough. And there's plenty of people, they were so scared, they were calling for more shutdowns while complaining that life is hard because like nobody's making money, because jobs are being affected, or you can't, business can't survive because they can't open their doors. So it was a problem created by the government with the solution of the government, which now it's feels like it's the problem and solution all in one place.
Yeah, well, that's a good response, and I would say as well, Konstantin Kisin talked about this in a recent, I think maybe a month old or so debate, where they were talking about immigration in the UK, and a lot of the immigration policies in the UK mirror Canada's policy mirrors them, and what we don't talk often enough about when we talk about immigration and the rapidly increased numbers that we're seeing entering the country of newcomers is what this serves to do is it serves to lower productivity. And the reason why it does that is because you have a group of people who are coming from such dire circumstances that any job that they could possibly get in their new country in the first world is going to be an upgrade. So so when we talk about drop in productivity, countries like Canada and the UK are very quick to talk about their GDP and the growth of the GDP. What they don't talk about is GDP per capita. And the reason is because if they reported it that way, you would see that productivity as a whole is dropping year over year as a nation, because you have so many people working low-skilled jobs for low pay willingly that there is no incentive to increase the pay for those jobs, or to move people into the higher earning echelons of the workforce. So when we talk about the inflated money supply, we also need to talk about in the same sentence how much our money is being devalued by the extreme drop in productivity that we're seeing as a country. We're not growing the economy. We're just growing the amount of people earning less in the economy.
Yeah, I think that goes hand in hand of like, well, we've restricted like domestic oil production. We've restricted these other things while importing more, which as more people enter Canada, and Canada being a little bit more socialized when it comes to our kind of social safety net, I don't think our social safety net, these like our hospitals, education systems, we don't have any mechanism in place to really robustly grow those at the same rate of the same quality. And then if you bring people in that come from dire circumstances, and they're going to need some of these services. So again, we're diluting. Well, this is why our wait times are so high. Ultimately, like there's a rate of like actual manageable immigration and or a demographic which is like more sustainable than others. And even if somebody like doesn't agree with this, you could press them and you could find a number value of like, well, Canada has 40 million people. What would happen? They're saying like, well, 1 million's fine. That's fine. It's no problem. It's like, well, what happens if tomorrow you brought in 5 million people all in one day? What about 10 million? What if we increased by 50% the population in like, you can see how at some point the problems are going to get like, they would be more and more dire. And you would create like a collapsing point of like the systems that you have cannot sustain with the people that coming in. There's also the time for people to actually become like actually integrated, and there's less and less incentives to become integrated if people are able to kind of live within their own communities and don't learn the language, and if they don't 100% reflect the values of Canada, then you're running into other issues of, well, can Canada, rather than being a melting pot, you just have a splatter of different cultures that at some point, and we're seeing more kind of race-based conflicts here. Like you have disparity with kind of tribalism between groups. You're going to get an increasing like number of just people being at each other's throats that way. So
that's right. Yeah. Well, I mean, we talked about that last week with the Hindu and the Khalistani protests. I just bring this up here because the Victoria-based,
really good.
Yeah, Victoria-based Aaron Gunn. I think he's running for Parliament now as a Conservative.
Aaron Gunn doing these amazing investigative. He will go around interview like some of the key individuals who are knowledgeable and or have good insight into these issues. So
yeah, this Waiting to Die documentary, it's curious for me to see actually this view count compared to some of the other ones, especially this, this one is about essentially the fentanyl crisis in BC. This one has the least views out of all of them, but this one arguably to me was the most poignant because people in Canada don't like to talk about, well, we like to think that our healthcare system is something to be envied. And actually in the Western world, it's one of the worst. And we're not ready to have that conversation as a country because we've based so much of our national identity on this notion of free healthcare, without any real people just don't have the context to understand how bad our healthcare is compared to most other civilized Western nations, specifically the Nordic countries in Europe. So when you hear this documentary is definitely worth watching because he interviews a lot of people from European health agencies where they talk about how, like, a lot of people don't know, but most modern Western health agencies have a mixed private-public system, and this, amongst other reasons, serves to make both significantly better. And so when we talk about, even the notion sometimes of having any sort of dual system in Canada is poo-pooed immediately, and you're accused of wanting to bring, American-style healthcare to Canada. And the reality is there's just so much in between those two systems. The U.S. system has its benefits for certain people. If Viva Fry talked about recently on a podcast about how, because he lives part-time in Florida now, he says, well, you pay a lot of money for private health insurance in the U.S. And you get decent care, or you could pay a lot of money in taxes to fund a shitty healthcare system in Canada. So it'll end up working out about the same. But specifically the Northern European countries with their mixed private public system, they are so superior to ours in almost every way. The public system functions so much better. Yeah.
You get a base level of guaranteed coverage.
Yeah.
And then the overflows. I think the key part is that it's not, they have some restrictions on that. Like a doctor cannot dedicate 100% of their time to a private clinic. They must balance out some of the hours. So it's not like they're poaching talent. They're not punished for making some money in the private. There's still incentives for for these small clinics to start up. And now you have a expanded capacity, because one of the restrictions in Canada right now is that you've got a certain amount of funding. And if you've funded all your surgery beds, you could have 2 open beds. The beds are physically open. you have somebody willing to do a surgery on that bed, but they can't fund it. Therefore, you have capacity that can't be met with the funding that you have.
Yeah.
And there are people that, well, they have to wait 8 months for a surgery. They would pay money to fund their own service. So you have a mismatch between the demand and the supply, and it's kind of just being blocked in the middle. So there is some in between that could be approached. And the problem is, you mentioned that the conversation gets distorted. And again, that you mentioned that thought terminating cliche of American style healthcare or American style politics, or when you build an ethos around these terms, it's easy to demonize. And I was going to actually ask you, because you watched this right before, and this is a really good example of the insanity that's happening in Canada right now, is what are your thoughts on Diagolon and Jeremy McKenzie and this whole, the liberals have had 5 days in a row like ragging on Diagolon, which I'm sure there's people who eat that up and they think Diagolon's this bad, this alt-right like accelerationist group.
Yeah, they're like I feel like the people who have that image in their head, they view it as like a biker gang or something, like rolling through a town and causing mayhem, like as if it's anything more than a meme country made up by a shit poster online. But actually our Twitter got blocked by a Canadian politician who I asked the other day if the Diagolon was in the room with us right now, and he didn't like that. But it's funny. I actually don't know that much about Jeremy McKenzie, but I know that he has a podcast, and I know that he is a political commentator of a type. And I think you actually know more about the creation of it than I do, but from what I understand, this was somebody made an observation that essentially if you drew a diagonal line from Alaska to Florida, it sort of intersects all of the more conservative type provinces and states in the US and Canada.
Yeah,
and
that was in the middle,
an interesting observation.
In the middle of the pandemic and the lockdowns, they're like, well, all these provinces and states seem to be like a little less restricted and a little more based in their way. So that was definitely, it was the amount of thought put into it. It was like, well, it was a brilliant thing. They made a little flag with the slash,
a flag,
and went from there.
Well, and I know too that Rachel Gilmore, one of our worst Canadian exports, and I'm so sorry for anyone outside of Canada who has to put up with her. This is the woman, by the way, who essentially, I don't think she was the source of it, but she certainly did spread the lie during the Freedom Convoy that members of the Freedom Convoy attempted to arson an apartment building and duct tape the doors shut. Of course, it was. I don't even think it was an arson attempt. I think it was just some kid screwing around. But it absolutely was not related to the Freedom Convoy. She's never retracted it. Over 2 years later, she references it from time to time, and she has no shame about doing it. So she's an awful person, and she is obsessed with Diagolon. She every opportunity she gets to reference this meme flag, she does. And for whatever reason, apparently the federal Liberal Party just does not fact check any of their talking points before they make them, and they've made a thing out of Poilievre's stopping off at a roadside like carbon tax camp
there was
chatting with some people.
The little Diagolon flag penciled in, like drawn on the side of a Winnebago or like a RV.
Of a trailer door, right? Yeah.
And that was enough. That here's the thing: if they have legitimate things to talk about, they should. But right now, this seems like it's such a stretch. They are in such dire need for just some sort of guilt by association, some sort of
Yeah.
They need something, and they are grasping at straws, and it's amazing to see them dive this hard into it. And and the funny thing is, well, Jeremy McKenzie and the other people who are part of this Diagolon group, they don't even like the CPC. They are very
they're
critical.
not even Polyev fans. Yeah,
they are. Well,
they're like PPC adjacent, right?
A little bit. They're not hard. I don't think
in as much as a made up flag country can be.
Yeah, that's the thing. Well, like even they're pretty like they've been, if Bernie or Maxime Bernier does something that they don't like, they'll call it out. So they're pretty good at just calling out what they don't like. Not to say that all their views are as savory as others, but you should be able to like, well, just address their views for what they are. Don't play games of like this guilt by association. It's like, well, we've got clown world politics going on right now.
Well, and the RCMP even said, and this was proven through a Freedom of Information Act request, that they are not even on the radar of any policing agency as a terrorist group or an extremist group or anything like that.
Their group does not meet the definitions of a structured organization.
Yeah,
partially because it's like the equivalent of a like podcast fan group. Like
it's like
they've had a
Joe
few
Rogan
meetups.
Bros. Yeah. It's Joe Rogan Bros, except like
imagine
100,000th of a percent.
Maybe you had the Elk Meat Club, like Joe Rogan fan club. And they got together, and some of them love hunting, so there's a few of them have guns, and you could point to that and be like, look at those accelerationists and their guns. Like if you try hard enough, you can demonize anything and paint it, and like so.
Well, and as with many things in the the culture wars that modern leftists try to involve themselves in and create, the need for hate outstrips the supply, and so they need to make up bullshit like this in order to seem like they're maintaining the proper level of social and cultural awareness and whatever sensitivities they want to appear to be privy to as a organization.
Yeah, it's easiest to fight from the moral standpoint of you claim the moral superiority, and then you just fill the gaps and try to justify your own position with, you create evidence out of thin air. And that's the strategy. We see it all kinds of places, and also this will come up later, but what bothers me the most is the inability to like talk about issues in an honest way, I don't care what somebody's position is. I care that they give valid reasons. They understand all sides of the argument. If somebody's unable to look at all sides and actually consider, or if somebody's arguing against us and they misrepresent our point and frame it in a way that's just complete BS, that's where I draw the line. Like I'm happy to disagree with somebody in a perfectly rational debate, but when you frame things in a way that it's like you're missing the fundamental point, and you're just either you're falling into your belief system talking points. If you just regurgitate that rather than engaging in the actual points, you're not getting any closer to understanding the world around us. And that's what these conversations are. We have to navigate the world, and you have to understand what's going on, and we have to be able to like actually address the points.
Well, thanks so much as always, James. I really appreciate your thoughtful commentary on all this stuff, and always a pleasure to bounce ideas back and forth with you, and love these chats, and thank you everyone
gets
who's watching.
Me thinking. So
yeah. Well, we've sort of been been blessed to have some good views and hits and likes in our few of our videos recently, and we really appreciate that. And thanks everyone for watching and commenting. Even those who are commenting who think that we're so wrong about everything and have no idea what we're talking about. We like that too, because it
want to
helps us
know
refine
how
our
we're
points.
wrong. Yeah.
Exactly. I love it. So keep commenting and liking, and thank you for everyone who is watching, and we'll see you in about a week.
All right. See you in the next one.
Cheers. See ya.
Cheers.